Final Fantasy Tactics asks a great deal of its players. Challenging but rewarding battles are balanced alongside a complex and deeply political plot, populated by characters that run the full spectrum of human experiences. There's a lot to love about this title, and it's a shame that for so long it's existed in the shadow of the mainline franchise. Which is why I'm so excited for the Ivalice Chronicles remaster, featuring a new localization and full voice acting. And a good chunk of my excitement comes from the simple fact that more exposure means more people will get to experience and discuss this story and its characters, like one of the most notorious anti-villains players will encounter as they travel through Ivalice. I am, of course, talking about Wiegraf Folles, egalitarian activist in an unjust society and recurring enemy over the course of the game. Since my first playthrough of Tactics, his deeds and discourse have remained in my mind, not least in part due to the falsely attributed quotes that have been floating around the internet for far too long. And in a time where uncertainty and fear are doing their best to reign supreme, I think it's worth revisiting what makes him such a great character, even decades on from his first appearance. By the way, there's gonna be spoilers ahead. Consider yourselves warned. The 50 Years' War. A conflict originally orchestrated by Ivalice as it attempted to invade the neighbouring province of Ordalia prior to our induction to Tactics, the war ended peacefully on paper. Realistically, it ended with Ivalice's defeat. The country was bankrupted by the reparations that followed, and soldiers drafted from the lower classes found themselves discharged without pay. One of these soldiers fought as commander of a group known as the Dead Men during this war. Left impoverished after his years of service, he surrounds himself with equally discontented veterans, now named the Corpse Brigade, and considered a company of felons by the nation at large, their demands discredited. We as players never see the full list of demands. It's impossible to know whether this group has fought for payment only, or if there were other issues brought up in the wake of the war's end. But by the words and deeds of their leader Wiegraf, it's clear that compensation alone isn't enough. He has settled on no less than the concept of revolution. To him, Ivalice's future is best served by overturning the aristocracy. His desire for parity is admirable, but like any other well-meaning leftist group, the road to this future is paved with infighting and betrayal. We're treated to the knowledge that at least 2 of the brigade have been bought by the nobility to sow discord from within. One of them being Gustav Margrif, whose biography titles him as Lieutenant Commander, making him, ostensibly, Wiegraf's second. Bought by the highest powers of Galleon, Gustav is the one who orchestrates the kidnapping of Marcus Elmdor,
Judith, no,
and tarnishes the name of the brigade beyond repair. It's noted in character biographies and rumours that the brigade as a whole is considered a terrorist organisation, though Wiegraf himself is staunchly against hostage-taking, at least for now. No one can accuse Wiegraf of leniency, however. From his first moment on screen, he's shown threatening one of his bought men for information, and his interaction with Gustav has him cut down his so-called comrade for acting against their best interests. Whether or not he knows Gustav has turned traitor is unknown, but it indicates that Wiegraf is unwilling to compromise on his morals, nor is he willing to negotiate with the nobility. And why should he? There is, after all, nothing to lose but one's chains. Our view of Ivalice is delivered to us through Ramza Beowulf, who disavows his life as a nobleman after Chapter 1. Through him, we see a slice of what life at the top is like. A castle to live in, a family that wants for nothing, and ties with one of the contenders to the throne. But it's Ramza's closest allies, not his family, that gives us a clearer look into the realities of Ivalician society. First up is Dalita Eral, a common boy who fell into dubiously good fortune alongside his sister. He was brought up alongside Ramza, but remains acutely aware of his position in the world at all times. A moment of respite on the Mandalia Plains clues us into his true feelings of incongruity, and encounters with individuals of both the upper and lower classes see him reflect on his place in the world repeatedly. We're also told that his younger sister Titra is bullied at school, specifically for the circumstances of her birth. The other boy in their age range can't in good conscience be called a friend. Argath, son of the disgraced noble house Thedalphus, is presented initially as well-meaning, if obsequious to an obnoxious degree, but the veneer is shattered when he has the chance to interact meaningfully with those of lower status than himself. His thoughts are no doubt an extrapolation of noble society as a whole if pushed to the extreme. He continually mocks those of low standing, dehumanizing them in vicious tirades, and expresses surprise when Ramza challenges his viewpoint. The extremity of his disdain culminates at the end of Chapter 1, where we satisfyingly beat Argath to a bloody pulp, And it's here more than any other time we're most likely to agree with the Corpse Brigade's desire for equality, struck for the first time, the second time, struck by the pure glee with which he wields both scorn and power. Likely in a mirror of the way his family has been treated since his grandsire's treachery in, once again, the 50 Years' War. Ivalice's hierarchy then is clearly deeply biased, and it comes as no surprise that at least some of its inhabitants are in opposition to its classist structures. While we're never privy to everything the Corpse Brigade is asking, and therefore remain ignorant of how they've decided is the correct way to achieve equality, it's not impossible that their message was resonating with its target audience. Consider that the nobility were actively working to undermine the brigade, and if we take Rams's words in Aubon at face value, knowing how the common folk are currently suffering under yet another war and natural disasters, the biggest surprise to us players is that we remain ignorant to how goings-on are received, generally speaking. However, just like Ramza and his associates representing the extremes of noble opinions, we can look to Wiegraf's comrades for a similar view. On the one hand, Gustav and his ilk tire of the group's messaging and relentless protests. Seeing no end but their own, they would rather lay down arms and return to the status quo if possible. On the other, Wiegraf's sister and fiercest supporter Wiegraf Folles thinks the Corpse Brigade hasn't gone far enough, and we face her repeatedly after having our call for peace and discussion rebuffed multiple times. Just as within the nobility, the true sentiment of the common class likely lies somewhere between these views, but as with the nobility, this is never focused on by the story proper, and has the added disadvantage of being actively quashed by the upper classes too. It follows by design then that there's no room for compromise between these groups, which leads to a single inevitable conclusion: tragedy. The death of his sister is the final catalyst necessary for Wiegraf's change in ambition and allegiance. A War of the Lions exclusive scene shows the moment he, as an impoverished and fugitive veteran with neither allies nor power, is offered clemency by the Church. Through Lothri, it offers a continuation of his ideals, though it comes at a price. Here is an institution who, up until this point, has been neutral with regards to the topic of recompense. Its lack of involvement until this moment, when realistically only a single member of the Corpse Brigade remains, is suspicious at best. But for our newly minted sacrificial lamb, that no longer matters. Without the Church's power, Wiegraf is unable to do anything, be that exact revenge, further his cause, or even fade into obscurity. Without this framing, his transformation into Leal Church lapdog is sudden and surprising. The majority of Chapter 3 is exempt from his presence, and his return to the story as someone no longer working under his own power is a far cry from the individual we met earlier. Having said that, his role as a Knight Templar is in keeping with his prior actions. He still eludes the Order's justice, bears a grudge against the nobles, House Beowulf in particular, and has zero problems using violence to achieve his goals. It cannot be overstated that in his role as commander of the Corpse Brigade, Wiegraf is shown from his very first scene to have no problem with physically intimidating, and later full-on assaulting, those loyal to him in name, if not action. His fall from grace as a knight with uncompromising views to a man who has no problem pillaging a religious building in the name of another is both unfortunate and tragic, if predictable. There are no wider repercussions of his change of allegiance either. After his meeting with Lothri, the Corpse Brigade are never again considered a threat, though we know the common folk remain oppressed for the remainder of the story. Most likely, those remaining faithful to the cause were either executed or went into hiding, their message diluted after being repeatedly routed, and lost entirely after the War of Succession became the nation's most pressing issue. And who could blame them for hiding, really? The overall degradation of Wiegraf's character is representative of a much greater problem: the corrupting power of, well, power. It's worth asking how much agency those not in high places have to begin with. The peasantry were drafted into the 50 Years' War, not having offered their services directly. The lower classes starve purely because of their lineage, and refusal to cooperate sees a village burnt to the ground and its survivors pressed into service. These experiences allow those not on equal footing with the nobility to be easily co-opted by both political and religious powers, and nowhere is this seen more clearly than in Wiegraf. Echoes of the man he once was can still be seen when we face him for the last time as a human, but at this point in his characterization, his principles no longer matter. In an ideal world, there would be no need for violence, and we would be able to talk Wiegraf down, but tactics reminds us that such a thing is rarely possible. Especially not when our opponent has access to a device intended to end a battle before it begins. Whether or not Wiegraf believes in the ideals of the church is moot, as he does their bidding regardless, and is rewarded by transcending mortal existence. His short-lived existence as Bellius is best remembered for the utter excessive strength it displays. And let's be real, who among us hasn't absolutely whiffed it repeatedly in Riovanes? And while not the only Lucavi to display animalistic features, I doubt it's a coincidence that the host for the ram-headed Bellius is the only one we know of that's lowborn. Judeo-Christianity is rife with connections to sheep, whether that be titling the decidedly not upper-class Jesus as the Lamb of God, referring to adherents as a flock in need of a shepherd, or even as a symbol of atonement whose sacrifice would absolve individuals from unintentional sin. Though the Church of Glabados no doubt meant for Bellius to have been part of the ruling class in their vision of Ivalice, Wiegraf himself was led to slaughter at its direction. He dies having renounced his morals out of desperation, with his desire for a more egalitarian society bastardized by the establishment that truly runs Ivalice, and is primarily remembered not as the deeply complicated man he is, but as a bottlenecking villain with the ability to render your efforts up until this point entirely useless. Which brings us to the question, was Wiegraf right in what he did? Any of it? By the time the credits roll, very little of the status quo has actually changed. The common people's plight is overshadowed quickly by more nefarious plots that push the focus back onto the upper class, whether that be Ramses' abdication of his family, the exploration of Avilia's agency and lack thereof, or the fact that the church is being run by, actual demons. That's not to say that the world of Ivalice is unchanged by the events of Tactics. Without our involvement, it would undeniably be in a much worse place. But we're introduced to the world with the knowledge that Ramso was written out of history, and his contribution to ending the church-sanctioned War of the Lions erased, his accomplishments instead accredited to Delita. It takes, by my estimation, maybe half a millennia before the truth is unveiled. But of course, the scholar Arislam isn't interested in highlighting whatever enactments happened after this period of time. We just don't know whether anything changed for the better under the new monarchy's banner, and the man that ends up sitting the throne is as complicated as the one that sought to topple it. If anyone was going to change the world, it would be Delita. He himself has been so radically altered by the machinations of Ivalice and her ruling classes that he is, by game's end, indistinguishable from the young man that once made a whistle of a blade of grass. One of the longest ongoing debates in the real world is whether Delita is good or evil, right or wrong. And honestly, I think that trying to define him as one or the other is a pointless task. People are complicated. No human has or will ever exist as either perfect saint or pure demon. By focusing on whether a character is good or bad, whether that be Delita, Wiegraf, Meliadul, Argath, or any other member of the cast, we prevent ourselves from considering in detail the core questions the narrative asks of us. It's at this point that I bring your attention to the climate that birthed Final Fantasy Tactics. Political change, natural disasters and the mismanagement thereof, religious zealotry pushed to its most extreme form, and overwhelming financial instability following the collapse of the then bubble economy. All these issues crop up in one form or another in Ivalice, but we as players are only invited to treat with some of them. Does the focus on the church's stronghold negate the impact floods and famine have on the wider populace? If we disengage from the selection of a new head of state, are we allowed to concern ourselves with their policies? What do sentiment and intention count for in a world where actions matter most? And what does it say about us if we refuse to participate with every matter that comes our way? No matter how political their nature, from the topics they visit to the way they visit them, I want to remind you that video games are not praxis. It's all very well developing one's opinions and mindset using a variety of topics and methods in which to do so, and I am including analytical essays here. But ultimately, these discussions of a fictional world change nothing about the real one, and it's the real world that matters most. So, Wiegraf, villain or vindicated? It's hard for me to condemn an individual who's reacting to the world around them, and I don't think it particularly matters whether or not his increasingly desperate actions were right or wrong. We live, after all, in a world where the gap between social classes is ever widening, where groups hiding behind the title of religious piety seek to criminalize financial freedoms, where endless cycles of war have eroded trust between peoples and nations. But this does not need to be the case, and it's up to us to build a better future. In the words of Yasumi Matsuno, father of Ivalice, The will to resist is in your hands.